Formula One just changed the rules, and it might have handed Max Verstappen total control of Miami.
Not next season. Right now. Because after just 3 races, the FIA was forced into an emergency rewrite of the regulations. 6 major changes. Instant effect.
And one of them removes a 50 km/h speed drop that was destroying races and creating chaos.
But here's the part no one expected. The teams that were winning just lost their biggest advantage. And the team that was struggling the most with the system just got exactly what they needed. If these changes work the way they're designed to, Miami won't be competitive. It will be controlled. And in a controlled race, Max Verstappen becomes almost impossible to beat. Red Bull didn't suddenly become slower this season. They became limited. And that's a very different problem. Because from the outside, it looked like performance had dropped. The results weren't there. The dominance was gone. But inside the data, the car was still strong. Still efficient. Still one of the most complete packages on the grid. The issue was something much deeper. Energy. From the very first race, the new regulations created a situation no team could fully predict. A system where electrical power wasn't just an addition. It was half of the car. 50% combustion. 50% electric. And that balance changed everything. Because now, managing energy wasn't just important. It was critical. Every straight. Every braking zone. Every acceleration phase. And this is where Red Bull started to struggle. Not with speed. With timing. Because the system was unpredictable. Batteries filling too quickly. Energy deployment happening at the wrong moments. And then, the biggest issue of all. Superclipping. The moment where the car suddenly loses speed on the straight. Without warning. Without braking. Up to 50 km/h, gone instantly. And for Red Bull, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a limitation. Because while other teams, especially Mercedes, learned how to manage that system, Red Bull couldn't control it as precisely. They were losing performance in the most critical parts of the lap. Not because the car was worse. Because the system was working against them. And that creates a very specific kind of frustration. Because you know the speed is there. You know the potential exists. But you cannot access it consistently. Race after race. Lap after lap. And that's exactly what we saw. Moments where Verstappen looked unstoppable. Followed by moments where he couldn't defend on the straight. Not because of driving. Because of energy behavior. And this is where everything starts to shift. Because the FIA didn't just notice the problem. They were forced to act. Fast. After Australia. After China. After Japan. 3 races were enough. Enough to prove that the system wasn't just imperfect. It was unstable. Dangerous. And unpredictable. And when unpredictability becomes a safety risk, there is no debate. There is only one outcome. Change. Immediate change. And that is exactly what happened. 6 rule changes. All at once. All designed to remove chaos. To reduce extreme energy swings. To make the cars more predictable. And that sounds simple. But the impact is massive. Because Red Bull's biggest weakness was unpredictability. And Mercedes' biggest strength was controlling it. So now imagine what happens when that unpredictability disappears. When the system becomes stable. When energy behaves the same way every lap. Suddenly, Red Bull doesn't need to solve a complex problem anymore. They just need to execute. And execution is where they are strongest. But here's the key detail. These changes don't make Red Bull faster. they remove what was slowing them down. And that is far more dangerous. Because when you remove a limitation from a team like Red Bull, you don't get improvement. You get release. And a released Red Bull is something the grid has already experienced before. So now Miami becomes something very different. Not just another race. Not just another weekend. But the first real test of a new version of Formula One. A version where chaos is reduced. Where energy is controlled. Where performance becomes more predictable. And in that environment, there is one driver who benefits more than anyone else. Because when everything is stable, when everything is under control, when there are no random variables, no unexpected slowdowns, no artificial advantages, the difference comes down to one thing: precision. And that is exactly where Max Verstappen becomes unstoppable. But here is where everything flips, and why Miami could feel completely different from anything we've seen so far. Because once the chaos is removed, once the unpredictable energy spikes disappear, once the system stops interfering with the driver, something else takes over. Pure car performance. And this is exactly where Red Bull becomes terrifying again. Because for all the struggles we've seen, the core of that car never disappeared. The balance, the aerodynamics, the efficiency through corners, all of it was still there. Hidden behind a system that refused to behave consistently. Now imagine that same car. Without those interruptions. Without sudden energy losses. Without unpredictable slowdowns on the straights. Suddenly, the flow of the lap changes. Completely. Corner entry becomes cleaner. Mid-corner speed becomes more stable. Corner exit becomes more aggressive. And most importantly, acceleration becomes predictable. And this is where Verstappen operates at a different level. Because he doesn't just drive fast. He builds rhythm. Lap after lap. Corner after corner. And rhythm only exists when the car behaves the same way every time. That's what these rule changes are giving him. Consistency. And consistency is control. But here's where things go even deeper. Because the changes don't just affect Red Bull. They directly reduce what made other teams strong. Mercedes, for example. Their biggest advantage was not just power. It was energy management. They mastered the boost. They knew exactly when to deploy it. How to maximize it. How to create those massive speed differences on the straights. Now, that advantage is capped. Limited to 150 kilowatts. Which means all that precision. All that optimization. All that engineering advantage is suddenly worth less. And when you reduce the strength of the leader, you don't just close the gap. You compress the field. But compression alone doesn't decide a race. What matters is who adapts fastest. And this is where Red Bull has a hidden advantage. Because they were already operating without relying on those extremes. They weren't dependent on massive boost deployment. They weren't maximizing the system like Mercedes. So when the system is simplified, they lose less. And when you lose less than your rivals, you effectively gain. But there is one more layer. One that could decide everything before the first lap is even completed. The start. Because Miami will test a completely new procedure. No low drag mode. Only maximum downforce allowed off the line. That changes the entire launch phase. Less wheel spin. More grip. More stability. And fewer unpredictable movements into turn 1. Which sounds safer. More controlled. But also, less chaotic. And chaos is where opportunities appear. Without chaos, the race order stabilizes faster. And if Verstappen starts near the front, that stability becomes a weapon. Because once he is in clean air, once he controls the pace, once he manages the race from the front,
he becomes incredibly difficult to challenge.
not because others are slow, but because the environment no longer creates openings. No sudden slowdowns. No unexpected speed differences. No artificial overtakes. Just pure pace and clean execution. And this is where everything connects. The rule changes reduce randomness.
They limit extreme advantages.
They stabilize the system. They simplify behavior. And all of that leads to one outcome.
The driver with the most control becomes the most dominant.
And that driver is Verstappen. So now Miami is no longer just about upgrades,
Or strategy.
or even raw speed. It's about who adapts to a new version of Formula One the fastest.
A version where the car behaves.
Where the system is predictable.
Where every lap follows a pattern.
And in that kind of environment, there is very little room for mistakes.
Very little room for surprises. And very little chance to recover if you fall behind.
Which means one thing. If Red Bull gets this right from the beginning, if Verstappen finds that rhythm early, then what we are about to see in Miami might not be a battle. It might be control.
From the first lap
To the last.
And this is where the real danger begins.
Because once a driver like Verstappen finds control, he doesn't just maintain it. He expands it. Lap by lap. Corner by corner. And this is something most people underestimate. Because dominance in Formula One is not just about being faster. It's about removing every variable your rivals can use against you. And that is exactly what these rule changes are doing for him. Think about it.
No more sudden 50 km/h drops on the straight. No more unpredictable energy spikes.
No more artificial overtakes created by system failures. Everything becomes cleaner. More structured. More controlled. And in that kind of environment,
The race starts to stretch.
gaps begin to form earlier. And once those gaps appear,
They are much harder to close.
because the tools that allowed drivers to attack are now limited. The boost is capped. The energy deployment is smoother. The differences are smaller.
Which means overtaking becomes more difficult.
More strategic. More dependent on mistakes. But here's the problem. Verstappen doesn't make many mistakes. Especially when he's leading. Because once he gets into that rhythm, he manages everything. Tires. Energy. Pace. Every detail is calculated. Every lap is optimized. And without chaos in the system, there is nothing left to disrupt that flow.
But here's where things go even further.
Because this isn't just about Verstappen driving perfectly. It's about Red Bull operating perfectly around him. Strategy becomes clearer. Pit windows become easier to predict. Energy usage becomes more consistent. And when everything is predictable, decision-making becomes sharper, faster, more precise. And that creates a gap that isn't just measured in seconds.
It's measured in control.
Control of the race. Control of the pace. Control of the outcome. And once a team has that level of control, the race stops being a fight. It becomes execution. But there's one more layer. The psychological one. Because when drivers behind realize there are no surprises left, no sudden opportunities, no unexpected advantages, they start to take fewer risks. They wait. They conserve. They hope for something to happen. But in this version of Formula One, nothing happens by accident. Everything is structured. Everything is calculated.
And that plays directly into Verstappen's hands. Because he thrives in that environment. An environment where nothing is random. Where everything is earned. And where precision decides everything. So now, the entire narrative shifts. From unpredictability to inevitability. From chaos to control. And from competition to domination. Because if Miami confirms what these changes are designed to do, then the biggest question is no longer who will win. It's how early the race will be decided. And once that moment arrives, once Verstappen takes control, there may be nothing left anyone else can do to take it away.